It's Tuesday afternoon, 4 p.m. in Switzerland and 2 a.m. in Canberra. It's Space Café WebTalk time. Our Space Café WebTalk 33 minutes with Dr. Malcolm Davis will begin soon. Thank you for joining us for this very informative and definitely very inspiring talk today about Australia's look at space. As always, we appreciate your participation and your ongoing feedback. I'm Torsten Kriening, your host today and publisher of SpaceWatch.Global. We are a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly and daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcast. Latest episode, number 14, is out as of today, featuring space philosopher Professor Jim Schwartz. And it's another super cool podcast, and I really can encourage you to listen to it. It's available on all major podcast platforms. We are also opened our fan shop online for you, where you can support us actively and become a space watcher. Edition 1 has cool mugs, masks, awesome t-shirts, and brand new backpacks for you, your friends, and the ones you love. Your feedback, your support, in that case, is needed to keep our independent journalism alive. I can't repeat it enough. We need your support for what we do for you. If you have missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our web page in the event section and on YouTube. We host our Space Café web talks live on a weekly basis. It's already the 31st edition today. I hope you mark Tuesdays at the same time in your calendars. Today, I feel very guilty to keep my guests awake, but even more, I'm honored to be joined by an analyst and friend I really admire, Dr. Malcolm Davis. Welcome to the show. Malcolm is Senior Analyst of Defense Strategies and Capabilities at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, in Canberra. Prior to this, he was a postdoctoral research fellow in China-Western relations with the Faculty of Society and Design at Bond University. He has worked with the Department of Defense, both in Navy headquarters in the strategy and force structure area. Prior to this appointment, he was a lecturer in defense studies with the King's College London at the Joint Service Command and Staff College. He holds a PhD in strategic studies from the University of Hull, as well as 2 master degrees in strategic studies, including from the Australian National University's Strategic and Defense Studies Centre. His main research focus is on space policy and space security, as well as defense strategy and capability development, military technology, and the future of warfare. With that, I'm very proud to welcome you again, Malcolm, in my show. Let's start by setting the scene. Australia and space, it rings a bell for us in the industry for a decade and more. Why is 2020 different in terms of space in Australia than 10 years ago? Do we see another back to the future, as I discussed it with Chris Newman about UK? What is your view on that?
Well, look, thank you very much, Torsten, for having me on. I know it's early hours for me, but that's fine. I always enjoy talking about space, no matter what time of the day. To get straight to your question, look, I think this year and the last few years have been transformational about how Australia thinks about space compared to where it's come from. If you want to take the discussion initially back to the early days of Australia in space, in terms of the activities at Woomera, South Australia, in the 1960s and the 1950s. You know, we were involved in the European Launch and Development Organization and Weapons Research Establishment, where we were launching rockets, and we were involved in that side of things. And then ELDO essentially became the European Space Agency. They pulled out to French Guiana, and the Australian government didn't sustain the Australian space activities there. They basically pulled the financial rug out from under the feet of the Australian space community at that point. So space in this country just essentially went into hibernation. Nothing was happening for many years. And we went through decades in the 80s and the 90s where there were attempts to start up space activities again, but the government was never interested. And so without that government funding, nothing happened. We provided a suitable piece of real estate for the ground facilities, such as the Deep Space Communications Facility at Tidbin Villa just outside of Canberra, and obviously parks and so forth. But the actual aspect of launching payloads into space and designing satellites and so forth, it simply wasn't happening. So fast forward now to about 2015, and the government of Malcolm Turnbull, Prime Minister, decides to conduct a review into Australia's commercial space sector. And the results of the review come back with a resounding call for an Australian space agency. Mm-hmm. And I think, thankfully, Turnbull as Prime Minister had the vision and foresight to realise that the space sector had changed quite dramatically since the days of Eldo and Europa and so forth. And so there was solid government support by the Morrison government, by the Turnbull government, to support the establishment of an Australian space agency. I was at the International Astronautical Congress in Adelaide in 2017 when the government announced the formation of the space agency. A huge roar of applause went up in the audience because it meant that finally Australia was on the right path. And we haven't looked back since then. We've now got one of the most fastest growing, vibrant commercial space sectors in the world. That space sector is totally supported by government. It is, the government is 100% behind it in terms of ensuring that it grows and expands and remains vibrant. And I think that we have really exciting times ahead of us. It's important to note that the Australian Space Agency, when it was established in July of 2018, is not a mini NASA down under or a European Space Agency type organisation. Its role is to stimulate the growth of the Australian commercial space sector primarily. And so it has, when you read its civil space strategy that was released in 2019, it has as its main objective the growth of that sector and the growth of jobs and opportunities, in addition to the international engagement aspects, as well as space policy and shaping the next generation of leaders in space. So from my perspective as a space analyst, space policy analyst here in Canberra, these are exciting times to be involved in space because the whole area in Australia is growing very rapidly. We have a forward-looking government now with Scott Morrison, who is fully supportive of space. The Labor Party opposition is supportive of space. So I don't see space as an area going away again or suffering a reversal. I think it's here to stay and we're on the right path.
That sounds super exciting. And let's dig into that a bit further. Australia, as you just mentioned, is actively supporting commercial launchers, and we reported on SpaceWatch.Global about it. Let's speak for a moment about sovereignty. Because, I mean, there are many countries worldwide that are looking for commercial small and bigger launchers. In your neighboring country in New Zealand, you have one of these, New Kids on the Block. And so, but how has your space policy changed, moving away from the dependency on others, on the big ones, or to sovereign space capabilities?
Well, it's still a process in development. I think particularly with space launch, we're not quite there yet here in Australia. We have a number of companies in Australia. Gilmore Space Technology on the Gold Coast is probably the market leader in terms of developing sovereign launch capability. But you also have Black Sky Aerospace also in Queensland that are developing launch technologies. You have companies developing launch sites. So Equatorial Launch Australia is developing a launch site in Nullumbi near Gove in the Northern Territory that benefits from being very close to the equator. You have Southern Launch that will be establishing the Whalers Way launch site in South Australia for polar orbit, sun synchronous missions. There's some discussion about a potential launch site at Abbott Point in Bowen in Queensland, although I think to be honest, that's still a little bit vague and uncertain going forward, but certainly 2 out of those 3 are happening. So I think that in terms of the sovereign launch capability, it's going very well. We're going through a process with the Australian Space Agency of deregulating space launch so that it's able to occur without generating suffocating insurance costs to the operator, and I think that's underway. And you're obviously having companies in Australia that are developing satellites. Particularly, we're focusing very much on the small satellite and CubeSat type architectures. I don't think anyone here is focused on building large, complex satellites, what I call Winnebagos in space that cost $1 billion each. The focus is very much on the small satellite CubeSat architecture for defense and national security purposes, but also for civil applications as well. And there's a whole host of companies that are focused very much on the ground segment and how we use space capability to open up new sectors of the economy. For example, Geoscience Australia, which is a government-run organisation, is instrumental in establishing SBAS, which is enhanced GPS functions to enable new types of economic activity in industry. So there's all this activity happening.
Such as? What can that be?
Well, they focus, when they talk about SBAS, they talk about, for example, new applications for agriculture and farming. But I think it goes well beyond that. I think SBAS, for example, could better enable driverless cars and have application in the Internet of Things and logistics and urban planning and all these sorts of areas. So I think it's not just about farming. I think there's a whole range of applications there for SBAS. But to get back to the point about dependency versus sovereignty, look, we were in the past heavily dependent on others to provide the space segment for us. We provided that ground segment, the suitable piece of real estate, the ground facilities and the people to man them. But we really relied on the United States and other allies, as well as commercial actors, to provide the space segment, the satellites and the launch vehicles. Now we're moving away from that dependency because we recognize that the growth of Space 2.0 technologies and the paradigm shift in commercial space means that we can do the space segment ourselves without incurring massive cost. We're no longer talking in terms of Apollo moon mission type costs to get into space. So there's this proliferation or this democratization of space, I think, that is occurring in Australia, where suddenly we realize we can do the space segment too, including sovereign space launch from this country. And the future that I see going forward is once government gets on top of the regulatory aspects and catches up with the commercial sector in terms of space launch, you will see Australian satellites launching on Australian launch vehicles from Australian launch sites. And that to me is a sign of when we have come of age as a space program, we have reached a level of maturity where we can think about the next steps. So we're edging towards that point whereby we have that ability to launch Australian satellites on Australian launch vehicles from Australian launch vehicles from Australian launch sites.
No. As mentioned earlier, a number of companies at the moment worldwide are developing launch capacities. Even in Germany, in Europe, we have a few of them. So, and taking into account your knowledge about the defense market, so what are the implications on the defense users? Because I know many of these launcher companies are looking into the defense market as one of their potential growing markets. So how will that work with these commercial actors and the defense one? I mean, can fast response be achieved by these commercial actors from your point of view?
Yes, look, I think if we stuck with the traditional Space 1.0 approach of large satellites, then we wouldn't be able to effectively compete in the space launch market because we're not set up for that. But given that we're not doing that, we're focusing very much on small satellites and distributed fractionated constellations of CubeSats that are working together as a network for defense applications. The potential is there, for Australia to be able to leverage small satellites and CubeSat technologies on our own local launch capabilities, to be able to launch those satellites quickly. Now, we do need, I think, to invest in fourth industrial revolution techniques and technologies to manufacture these satellites. So we can't have a single satellite taking 2 years to build. That's just not going to work. So we need, I suppose, sort of to think about how we can exploit additive manufacturing, digital development and design, production line technologies, robotic assembly lines, so that we can quickly produce satellites, we can evolve them in a digital environment, upgrade them when we need to, and then have them ready to go as we need them. And I think that this gets into the whole burden sharing in orbit aspect, because that then gives us the ability not only to provide space capability on demand for the Australian Defence Forces, but also to provide space capabilities to key allies to augment their space requirements when necessary. And that makes us a much more valuable partner in space than just simply providing the ground facilities. So, I think that that's where we need to go, is have this advanced approach to how we think about manufacturing and design, think about how we can use digital development techniques wherever possible to speed up the development and manufacturing process for satellites, and how we can then exploit a fast innovation cycle so that we can leap ahead in space capability rather than have a sort of a fairly slow evolutionary process of space capability, the sort of things you see these days with NASA, for example. I do think we need to sort of more emulate the SpaceX and the Blue Origin type mindset rather than the NASA mindset.
You mean pouring in tons of money on this stuff? Yeah, I mean, I think that's all of us would like to see in all our space economies are in our countries, that there's really huge amount of money flooding in. But I don't think that was what you're referring to when talking about Blue or SpaceX and this market.
Yeah, look, I think that SpaceX and Blue Origin, particularly SpaceX, I think have been successful because of government investment, and I don't deny that. But what they do is they exploit a fast innovation cycle, and they generate rapid advancement in terms of their capabilities, to the point where you now have SpaceX testing Starship Super Heavy. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of those vehicles blow up on the pad, but that's not the point. What they're doing is they're learning from those tests. So I do think that on a smaller scale, for Australia, in terms of satellite design and manufacture, in terms of launch vehicle capability development, there's no reason why we can't exploit that fast innovation cycle at a smaller scale. We don't need to take a slow plodding approach. And I think that if we did take a slow approach, we wouldn't be competitive. So speed matters. And I think that's really important.
And I'm happy that we have one of the masterminds for small satellites here in our audience, my good friend, Professor René Laufer. And I think he listens very carefully what's going on in Australia. So maybe your help is appreciated down there. In our pre-talk, and you mentioned that earlier, in our pre-talk, you raised the topic of burden sharing in orbit with allies. And I think that was an interesting thought. Would you like to elaborate on that a bit, how you can share that?
Yeah, I think let's start with the Defence Strategic Update, which essentially is Australia's latest defence white paper that was released in July of this year. It elevated the importance of the space domain for Australia's Defence Forces, much more so than the previous 2016 white paper or previous white papers behind that. And one of the key things that it talked about was space is an operational domain in its own right. It's also a contested domain. So in other words, we are concerned about countries like China and Russia, who are developing a full suite of counter space capabilities, anti-satellite systems designed to be able to deny the United States and its allies access to critical space support at the outset of a conflict. And so one of the concerns that Australia has is preserving access to space capabilities, even in the face of the adversary using these sorts of counter space capabilities. So here I'm speaking very much as in my role as a defense analyst, as a strategic analyst, and thinking about that future war. As a key US ally, we have to be able to do more to burden share in orbit than just simply provide a ground segment. And that commercial space launch capability and the satellite manufacturing capability that we've talked about gives us the opportunity to do that. One of the key concerns of the US and the concern of Australia is building resilient space systems in the face of counter space threats. What we don't want to see is a space Pearl Harbor where an adversary uses those counter space systems decisively to knock out our critical space support at the outset of a conflict, so we're left deaf, dumb, and blind. We can maintain space resilience by augmenting space capabilities prior to a conflict, by putting up more satellites so that we're not relying on just a few large, vulnerable satellites. We can also disaggregate space capability across many smaller satellites to make it more difficult for an adversary to do a decisive Pearl Harbor in space. But we can also reconstitute space capability if an adversary does use counter space, so that it makes it more difficult for that adversary to have a decisive effect. And what we're talking about here is deterrence by denial in space. And Australia can play a role in all three aspects of that. We can support augmentation, we can support disaggregation by providing those small satellite technologies, and we can also provide reconstitution through sovereign launch capability. And so by doing those three aspects, in addition to the ground segment stuff that we already do with space domain awareness and satellite tracking and control, we suddenly become a much more important and more useful ally to the United States in space. And I think that's where we're going in terms of defense's thinking on space control. The Defence Strategic Update really made it very clear that Australia has to undertake a space control mission, including denying an adversary the ability to use counter space capabilities in an effective manner. And those three types of missions, the augmentation, the disaggregation, and the reconstitution missions, are how Australia could achieve that utilizing the commercial space capabilities that we've already talked about. So that's, I think, where we're going in terms of resilient space, how to make our space capabilities resilient even in the face of adversary counter space attack.
Yeah. One of these topics that is also very close to our activities at SpaceWatch.Global is space security, space debris awareness, to raise that in a wider audience on governmental level and on commercial level. Well, and you talked about what Australia can do in terms to support allies. So what are you doing, or what is Australia doing in terms of our space debris monitoring, our space control, all of these areas? I mean, it's mainly ground segment, but nevertheless, it's very important, of course, as well.
Well, in terms of space domain awareness, I think we're seeing that as an important new task. When you look back at defense white papers, previously it was first hinted at in the 2009 defense white paper that's suggesting that space situational awareness, as it was called at the time, was important. And then in 2013 and subsequently 2016, it was announced that there was a facility going to be built at Exmouth in Western Australia that would essentially undertake space domain awareness using a relocated US space surveillance telescope and a C-band radar. And that's still going ahead, and is in the process of being established. And the sensor feed from those instruments will ultimately be managed from an airbase just north of Adelaide in South Australia. And in terms of space resilience, I think that, and space domain awareness, you're also seeing a number of commercial companies in this country contributing and collaborating with defense in this mission. So Innovore Technologies, for example, have Project Hyperion, which is a space-based space situational awareness solution where they have a number of satellites deployed in MEO and GEO to monitor activities in space. You've got a number of ground-based efforts. EOS Australia, for example, are world leaders in laser optical space surveillance technologies. And there's a number of other companies out there that are doing a range of technologies on space domain awareness. There's also efforts by the University of Western Sydney, I think it is, to develop neuromorphic sensors that allow us to monitor space activities during daylight. So you're seeing a range of commercial companies in Australia, as well as the government-run, defence-run Exmouth facility to do space domain awareness. All of that obviously is focused on monitoring space debris and tracking that. But also can undertake space surveillance of adversary space activities and gather intelligence. And so those two tasks of space domain awareness, of tracking space debris, as well as monitoring adversary space activities to prevent the sort of Pearl Harbor in space type scenario that I talked about earlier, I think are really at the heart of our approach to space domain awareness.
Let's take one question in from Pelin or from Istanbul. How resilient space systems against cyber threats and regulations against that, and how to defend?
It's a great question, and something that I've thought about quite extensively and written about. I think that cyber threats against satellites also, or against the satellite ground stations, are a real challenge because cyber threats can obviously be generated not just from major power adversaries such as China or Russia, but they could be generated by a range of adversaries, including non-state adversaries, even the individual lone hacker that has the right equipment and the knowledge to be able to do it. And I believe that it was earlier this year in Las Vegas where they had a hackathon where the task given to the hackers was to hack a satellite. And this was actually run by the United States Air Force because they wanted to test their security. So yes, hacking satellites is a real thing. The potential to then use hacking and cyber attacks to deceive or spoof a satellite into giving false information, I think has to be a real concern, or even just to disable it, to take it down. I think that with the military grade satellites, the sort of high-end large satellites like wideband global SATCOM, it's more difficult to hack those, and especially the sort of big intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance satellites that are operated by the US National Reconnaissance Office. Very difficult to hack those. But militaries rely very much on commercial satellites to provide extra bandwidth during a conflict. That's happened in the 91 Persian Gulf War, in 2003, in the conflict over Yugoslavia and Afghanistan. And so the risk is that adversaries could exploit that backdoor through the commercial satellite systems to be able to get inside the Allied decision information loop and exploit that through hacking. So I do think that we need to think about how resilient those capabilities are, not just the satellites, but also the ground segment, the ground stations that control those satellites, and how we prevent an adversary from exploiting weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the commercial side of things to get inside critical command and control communications and intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance operations within the military.
But there are no regulation in place right now, aren't there?
No,
Okay.
It's wild, wild west. We can't stop hackers wherever they're located on the world from doing that. All we can do, I think, is try and protect against it, hence space resilience,
Sure.
and also to be able to, defend against it if necessary.
There's one question on the same track coming in from Kevin. Has there been discussion within the Australian government, either in defense and Australian Space Agency, regarding the role of space traffic management? Is that an issue? Is that high up on the list?
If it is, and it should be. We talked about space debris And we had a near miss between a Chinese rocket booster and a Russian satellite just a couple of weeks back. But the lessons of that incident are that we do need to really think about space traffic management. And I think that as our ability to do space domain awareness improves, our ability to contribute to the space traffic management task, which is going to become ever more important, will grow in time. So this is an area that I think Australia should be thinking about expanding into. How can commercial companies in particular contribute to this task in terms of monitoring space activities and managing the traffic? And that's one of the areas that the Australian Space Agency are probably thinking about, particularly in terms of regulatory reform and in terms of engaging with the commercial sector. Every year, Australia has 2 space forums in Adelaide. The next one is November the 25th in Adelaide, which I'll be attending. And space traffic management is probably going to be on the agenda for that. But yeah, it's an area that's really important.
My last question, how will the next 10 years look like in space for Australia with building all your capacities, and what implications are in for Australia's growing commercial space sector and the agency? So 10-year outlook. So
okay, take it forward to the 2030s. Barring unexpected black swan events like pandemics that have a significant impact on our economy, I think the future is pretty good. It's pretty positive from where I'm standing. As I said, I think both the current government and the political opposition are supportive of the Australian Space Agency and growing the Australian space sector. They recognise that this is a fast growth area that is going to grow jobs very quickly and expand and keep on expanding, even more so than other traditional areas of defence industry, for example, with shipbuilding. Space is growing far faster than shipbuilding. So government investment is likely to pour into this area more so. I think defence is far more switched on to space than what it was before. When I started at ASPI in 2016 and I started talking about space, speak to people up at defence, their attitude was, well, why do you want to talk about that? The Americans provide everything to us, so we don't need to think about it. Now, when you go and speak to them, they are focused on, okay, well, how do we develop strategy for space? How do we update our organisational structure to be able to potentially develop an Australian Defence Force Space Command? How do we work with the Americans and other Five Eyes partners and other states, such as Japan and India? So I think defence is looking at space in a far more sophisticated manner because they no longer they recognise that they no longer can afford to just be dependent on others to do space, and that's really important. We've been forced out into the light and said we have to actually do this ourselves. So looking 10 years forward, I would say that we will have the ability to launch Australian satellites on Australian launch vehicles from Australian launch sites. And you will see that happening on a regular basis in this country. I'll say that we will be involved in Project Artemis directly in terms of supporting those missions to the moon. My personal sort of wish would be that at some point later in this decade, we'll see an Australian standing on the lunar surface in a spacesuit with the Australian flag on that spacesuit, that you will not have to become an American citizen to go to the moon. I think that would be an inspirational moment for this country to see an Australian standing on the moon or on Mars, perhaps later in the 2030s. So I think that the commercial space will just keep on expanding for the ground segment, for the space segment. We'll find new ways of utilizing space capabilities in our economy. And people by 2030 will see space as something that, is just part of our society. And we'll be thinking then about what we want to do through to the 2040s. And that's where I would argue we would have shifted from Space 2.0, which is the commercial aspects of space, to Space 3.0, which is a space-based economy. And how do we participate in that next big leap from where we are now towards a space economy that I think is starting to take shape on the horizon.
Jan Werner is on Space 4.0 already. So, however,
people talk about different numbers, but
yeah,
my number is Space 2.0 to Space 3.0.
get it.
I still am trying to understand what Space 4.0 is really all about.
So, but I take you that within the next 10 years, we will see Australian satellites flying on Australian rockets regularly from Australian soil. That's a great one.
Yeah.
And a decade later, we see potentially an Australian boots on the ground of the moon or on Mars. But I don't think that we will see anybody on Mars. But however, in our lifetime, but things might go quicker.
My view is the moon is more important because the moon, if there is substantial amounts of water there, then the moon can be the basis upon which we build a space economy. That's Space 3.0 step. And space-based manufacturing, and we start using in-situ resource utilization, and we can do many things. Mars will always be there. We'll get there when we get there. Hopefully, we'll get there fast and safe, and rather than, sort of like a hazardous boots and flags and footprints type mission. I don't want to see Mars just being another Apollo where we go and that's it, and we don't come back. Mars we have to do properly. So let's take our time. Let's focus on the moon first.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Malcolm. I'm afraid we have to come to an end because we got signals from our production already, and we extended the 33 minutes, and we want to let you go to bed. So, but be sure that we will follow up with Australian space development and future Space Café web talks and in our magazine, because spoiler alert, we will have our Stephen Freeland in a month from now, but we are not announcing that already. So, but our next special format, and might be very interesting one for you, but again, bad timing. It's on the 12th of November, Black Ops by Ralph Thiele. Our first session on military applications are purely in space, and he will talk about LEO MEO application. And then our second edition of the Space Café Moribas Vox Populi is planned for the 3rd of December with Moriba Jar talking about space environment. So, and our next webinars, next week I will speak with Chris Stott of Mansard about the topics of registration, licensing, and permissions that are needed to go to space. I mean, minor things, but super important. On the 10th of November, I will talk with Old Docker from Spaceport Norway about space in the dark, cold north. And on the 17th of November, I will talk with Mari Eltholm, also from Norway, about Norway's space ambitions from oil to orbit. All events are online on Eventbrite. And as always, we would like to hear from you, your feedback. So please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up to our daily and our bi-weekly newsletter. And if you like to treat yourself with something special, become a Space Watcher today. Your support will help us to continue our independent journalism for the news and these web talks. Take your credit card and visit our fan shop at shop.SpaceWatch.Global. And I know that I repeat myself, but we need your support to continue our work. Also, our space cafes are up for sponsorships. Thank you all very much for your interest today, and thank you, Malcolm, for this exciting talk and being my guest again at that early hours. And thanks to the entire team behind the scenes for doing this great job week by week again. So I hope you all will stay safe and stay healthy, especially now as we are all hit by the second wave. It's more than ever important that we all do what is needed to do to stay safe. Thanks for joining us. I hope to see you well and healthy next week. In the meantime, visit our website and follow us on social media. Don't forget, become a Space Watcher. Thank you very much. And good night, Malcolm.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Ciao.